Okay, today we're going to talk about two very important and seminal cultures, the Celts and the Saxons, how they fought, blended, and became what we now call Ireland and the British Isles. And when we speak about Celtic culture, we're often more familiar with it from drawings like these. This is actually a famous picture done by the illustrator Howard Pyle of Viviane, a Celtic woman in the Arthurian legends, the stories of King Arthur, very closely associated with sorcery and the supernatural. This picture, of course, is not from the Celtic period. The great Celtic period of legend and literature would run roughly from the 1st or 2nd centuries through the 12th and 13th centuries. Then there's another great period for the Celts in the early modern time, but we're focusing on an earlier time at this point. This is a 19th century imagining of Viviane the sorceress, but it does show the tremendous influence that Celtic myth and legend, with particularly strong female characters in their epics, would have on later literature. And of course, the most famous female image from Celtic literature has got to be Morgana le Fay, which comes to us, she comes to us rather from the pre-Christian Celtic heritage. And again, this is a 19th century Victorian drawing by the painter Edward Burne-Jones, reimagining Morgana le Fay. Now, who was Morgana le Fay in the legend? She's supposed to be the half-sister of King Arthur, king of the Britons, the Welsh part of the Celtic family. The Celts come originally from Central Europe, and they will spread out into northern Spain and primarily, of course, the areas of the British Isles and Ireland in particular. The figure of Morgana le Fay is associated with pre-Christian worship of the deer deity, Ceridwen, very important, god of the forest, with which the Celts were very, very closely connected. And Morgana le Fay, of course, is also deemed to be an evil sorceress. This, of course, is in the post-Christian legends, which view all examples of pre-Christian worship as sorcery. Now, the Arthurian legends, the cycle of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, is there any basis for them? Are they sheer mythology? Was there an actual Welsh chieftain in roughly the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era who fought the invading Germanic tribes, particularly the Anglo-Saxons? There is an archaeologist by the name of Geoffrey Ashe who believes there was, and that in fact the figure of King Arthur, so seminal and important in Celtic literature, located in the small country of Wales here, which we see in the right-hand side of this map. Possibly Arthur was a composite of a number of chieftains who fought Anglo-Saxon, i.e. Germanic culture, when it begins to invade the British Isles. How was Celtic culture reinterpreted and actually internalized by the Saxons, and how does this become British culture? Well, the unusual, possibly the most unexpected event, actually, in the complex history of the Celts and the Saxons is that after the Saxons conquer the Celts, they really appropriate their mythology. You might compare this to the Greeks and the Romans. It would probably be more accurate to compare it to the Aztecs and the Toltecs, many of the people of the New World, actually more than the Old World. So we're speaking about the Celts as though they include both the Irish and the Welsh, and the Scottish and the Cornish, and the Bretons, and a group of people called the Galicians in northern Spain. We're going to focus on the Welsh and the Irish. And the Welsh are known by the name Cymri, okay, or rather I should say the ancestors of the Welsh, and the Irish, of course, are known to us as the Gaels. The Irish are actually a combination of a number of people, the Celtic Gaels and also the Iberians, people originally from the Iberian Peninsula, of course, what later becomes Spain. And so we see that Celtic culture is not a unified whole, it is ethnically diverse. Now, one of the aspects of Celtic culture which actually ties it more closely to many of the Native American traditions of the New World, although there was next to no contact, if there was any at all, is the shamanic connection. And when I use the term shamanic, I'm referring to a belief the Celts had which is still very pervasive in Native American cultures and very strong in both Irish and Welsh contemporary literature, that nature is alive, that human beings are part of nature and not necessarily superior to it, and that everything within nature is holy and alive and blessed with a sacred essence. Saxon culture, the Germanic and later Christianized culture, tended to classify these beliefs of the Celts as supernatural, wrongly calling them magic or sorcery. In the image that you're looking at, one of the most famous images from Celtic tradition, again in a much later illustration, after the Victorian period, we see the Lady of the Lake on a swan boat. Swans in Celtic mythology and literature often were forms adapted by human beings with, let's not use the term magical, let's use the term spiritual power. People could change their shape, forms could change shape, and the Lady of the Lake, the spirit of the water, is giving King Arthur, that is of course the sovereign in the red and white clothing that you see on the left-hand side with the rampant dragon on his tunic, and his teacher Merlin, the magician, accompanying him. They're being given a sword. You see that in the distance, a hand, kind of ghostly, spectral hand rising from the water, holding the sword Excalibur, which of course will figure very prominently in the Arthurian legends. And just like to point out that among both the Celts and the Germanic Saxons, sword making, in fact anything that involved the use of iron, was considered a holy and occasionally magical profession, and this was due to the nature of the way the metal transmuted and changed in its contact with fire. So this leads us, of course, to the question, what is the place of weaponry in Celtic and Anglo-Saxon culture, and what is its connection with magic? Well, we met the sorceress Morgana Le Fay a little bit earlier in one of our pictures. Here she is throwing Excalibur back into the lake on the island of Avalon, and you see the hand of the Lady of the Lake grasping the sword, this idea of the hand offering the sword to the righteous winner, in this case King Arthur, and after Arthur's death, or death and reincarnation, his half-sister Morgana Le Fay throws the sword back into the lake. This demonstrates the belief in cyclical existence. This is part of Celtic mythology, which Anglo-Saxon culture to a certain degree will appropriate. And it will do so through the image of weaponry, because weapons are believed to carry the emanations, the qualities, the spiritual qualities of their owners. So a sword can become quote-unquote magical, or better to say, filled with power, based upon who is wielding it and what are the powers of that man and or women. Now, we can see that in both cultures, for the Celts and the Saxons, there's a very strong belief in an afterlife, and these two slides really bring this home. On the left-hand side, you're looking at an image of a Celtic cross. The Celtic crosses are one of the most famous examples of early Irish art, and they are stone sculptures, often placed in seacoast areas. The connection with the sea is not accidental for the Celtic peoples, and I'd like to add also for many of the Native American peoples. The sea is the source of life, and once the body has finished its time on earth, the soul goes back to the source of life, water. And so we have this very powerful spiritual connection with water. The Anglo-Saxons, again coming from the Germanic areas of Europe, who will invade England and Ireland, and well, actually they'll invade Ireland at a later date, when we already will refer to them more as mixed with the Normans, the people we will later call the French. But the Saxons who invaded England, and those are the ones you are looking at on the right-hand side. England, in fact, is named for them, Angleland, Anglo-Saxon. Just like the Celts, they believed very strongly in an afterlife, and it was also connected with water. This may be a bit of a Viking Norse influence. You're looking at a burial mask from the Sutton Hoo burial. If anyone ever goes to the British Museum, you'll find a magnificent collection of burial art representing the warrior. You see that here by the warrior's mask, and the final voyage to the afterlife. Now, Ireland, of course, will become the battleground between Celtic and Saxon cultures, and we're using the term Saxon here a little bit loosely. We're using the term Saxon as referring to the joining of Saxon and later Norman French cultures when the combined Normans and Saxons will begin to settle in Ireland in a military sense in the 12th century. Celtic culture, which itself, as we mentioned at the beginning, is actually a combination of Celtic and Iberian culture, resisted the Saxon influence, the Norman French influence. You're looking at an image of the Celtic harp and the bardic tradition. The tradition of the storyteller and the musician is quite sacred in Ireland, and the oral tradition will be one of the ways in which the Irish will preserve Celtic heritage, particularly when later English, i.e. Anglo-Saxon and Norman policy, will actually ban the writing and the speaking of the Irish Gaelic language. On the other side, of course, you have a beautiful image of a rainbow in an area called Connemara in Ireland, famous seacoast area, which will give us later on in the 16th century a famous lady pirate by the name of Grace O'Malley. And speaking of very strong women in Celtic tradition, let's look at two images from early Celtic mythology, one Irish, one Welsh. Queen Maeve, that's the full-face image, mythical character and possibly a historical character of early Irish pre-Christian tradition, who defends her lands and her cattle, representing wealth. Cattle are extremely important in early pre-Christian Ireland. She defends them with all the tenacity of a man, and she commands. Next to her, a slightly more romanticized image of Queen Guinevere. Some of you may recognize her as the mythical character in the Arthurian legends, getting back to the early Welsh cycle. Arthur's bride, who of course will later betray Arthur with Arthur's best friend Sir Launcelot. Notice the difference in the images. Maeve looks a bit firmer, angrier, full face, and Guinevere fits a bit more the later medieval stereotype of the gentle princess on horseback. The irony is that it is Guinevere who, in the legend, takes down Arthur's kingdom through her infidelity. She's quite a bit more destructive than Queen Maeve. Brehon law, what was that? Brehon law and gender. Brehon law refers to the pre-Christian world in Wales as well, but much more specifically Ireland. This was a system of inheritance which allowed Irish women to divorce their husbands by simply saying, I dismiss you, and it gave Irish women the right of inheritance, something which existed in very few cultures at that point, with the exception actually of biblical Jewish tradition in which women were allowed to inherit. We find that in the early books of the Old Testament. So the Irish are quite unusual in Europe in terms of allowing female inheritance. In the rest of the Celtic countries, including Wales, this is allowed to some degree, but less than in Ireland. And by the time the Saxons have conquered the Britons in England and Wales, they are also using and applying the earlier Celtic mythology for their own ends. So the legends merge, and we find many Celtic, i.e. forest elements in the Ballad of Robin Hood, particularly the druidical elements in the Great Oak of Sherwood Forest. That's the Great Oak you're looking at. And when we use the term druid, we are referring to the spiritual men and women of early Celtic culture. Again, this is in the pre-Christian era, when the tree is considered to be one of the sacred spots of the spirits of nature. Well, obviously, by the time of the either mythical or historical outlaw Robin Hood, in the late 12th, very early 13th century, Robin Hood is himself supposed to be a Saxon. But he appears to be a Saxon who fights the invading Normans, the French, and as a Saxon he appears to have imbibed a great deal of Celtic culture, and his headquarters in Sherwood Forest and the way in which He sacralizes the trees, all the great meetings of Robin Hood and his merry men and his lady love Maid Marian take place under the great oak. This definitely seems to speak to us of an earlier Celtic influence, because by the late 13th century in both England and Wales, when the Ballad of Robin Hood first appears in written form, it may have existed in oral form much earlier, the boundaries are pretty fuzzy. So despite much ethnic and cultural mixing, in Ireland itself, again, Ireland is always going to have a slightly different Celtic history than Wales, you find stronger boundaries between Celtic, Saxon, and Norman culture. Although, again, as we point out in our last bullet point here on this slide, we're talking about a question of allegiance, not a question of race. The boundaries in Ireland do not always follow ethnic allegiance, but they do follow cultural allegiance. So in other words, a Celt who decides to live as a Norman Frenchman will very much be a Norman. The cultures are separate. However, that does not mean, it does not betoken ethnic separation. There was a great deal of ethnic blending, even in the most unitary and apparently uniform cultural enclaves. Well, those Celtic and Saxon legends continue very strongly into the modern age. Among the first legends filmed with huge success, of course, we find the legend of Robin Hood, the Saxon outlaw who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, appears to be a bit of a tree-worshipping Celt, and of course falls in love with and conquers, in a good way, the Lady Marian, who is herself of Norman French background, and together, according to the legend, they bring good King Richard back to replace his tyrannical brother, King John. And this is an image from an old movie poster. And Robin Hood's images continue again with a mixed Celtic-Saxon influence. On the left-hand side, you see Robin Hood shooting the long bow and arrow, very important weapon at the end of the 12th century, with his hunting horn, and he appears as an image on a pub. Celtic literature and English literature discover each other and discover that they have far more in common than they have that is not shared. And on the other side, next to Robin Hood, you're looking at an ancient Celtic grave. Rocks in Celtic tradition, just as in Incan tradition in ancient Peru, were considered to be alive and part of the cycle of life. Putting the body into the rocks then is part of the life cycle. Death is simply a door to another existence. And so beyond warfare, and despite a very tragic period of conflict, particularly as we get more into the early modern period and English and Irish identities become quite separate, we can still say that they are the inheritors of a magnificent shared tradition. Once again, on one of the slides, we see one of the shields of the warriors of the Sutton Hoo burial. And although that is a Saxon Germanic shield, it also has the images of Celtic culture, because of course the cultures were in constant and dynamic interaction with each other. And the beautiful scene that you are looking at now from Connaught in West Ireland will have a tremendous influence on some of the greatest English and Anglo-Irish poets, such as William Butler Yeats. There is no way to separate England and Ireland, despite a very bitter history of conflict.